Good afternoon. You're watching Two on One. No, I can't do the accent. We're just gonna hi. Hey, you're watching Two on One, the internet's top sensation, where lords and ladies of climbing social classes come together to discuss the intricacies of popular culture and theology. I'm Lord Price Coffington of Emporiashire, one of your co-facilitators for today's discussion.
I can't even do it.
Oh, I'm afraid you must, because you are threatening to keep my first attempt in the record.
Oh goodness. Well, I'm Lady Waffleton. Waffletonshire. I'm
It's
unsure.
so wonderful to make your acquaintance, Lady Waffleton.
Welcome to Two on One.
Yes, welcome to Two on One, which sounds a bit improper, but it's chaperoned, fear not. Okay.
Project.
This is the Two on One project where we do talk pop culture rarely, but sometimes in British accents. And today we are, of course, doing Bridgerton. It is good to see you today, Spiff. I love your tiara.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
It was my COVID tiara for my birthday a couple years ago, in first year of COVID, when it was my birthday and I was alone and just hadn't left the house in months at that point, and I bought myself a very fancy bottle of champagne and a tiara and sat alone on my couch.
Well, kind of alone. I was there at the party.
There was a pseudo Zoom party that we attempted.
It was a good time. I was wearing athletic shorts and then like a dress shirt and a tie and my nice velvet jacket, which I only wear for special occasions. And today is a special occasion. Hey, speaking of which, though, so just recently, my associate minister, not my associate minister, the associate minister at the church I serve, was ordained. And one of the things that I got to do was I got to bust out my ordination stole, which is orange, from Jeff One-Row Designs.
I mean, that's exciting. Congratulations to your associate minister. I don't know if we're allowed to say her name, but that's a very exciting thing.
Good job, Olivia. Well done.
Good job, Olivia. And shout out to Margie Quinn, who also got ordained. We got some good people coming into the church. Yes, in my like again, and any of you that we forgot, let us know if you got ordained. We'll shout you out. It's a great day for the church to bring such incredible ministers.
And 'tis the season for ordination, which is so funny because when Easter is late, we're just like, let's do it during Lent. But the good news is, with Jeff One-Row Designs, there is a stole for every occasion. There is paraments, frontals, banners, every kind of liturgical textile you need. It's there because not only is there a huge catalog of all of these things you could possibly want to help enhance and inform your worship, from the smallest altar accessory to the biggest processional banner you can imagine, but they have customization options outside of their catalog where what you want is what you will get with Jeff One-Row Designs.
It's so true. Jeff makes incredible things. I don't think he makes one for this season of my life, in which I broke my leg last week. So if you see my face, or those of you that are just listening, you wouldn't have noticed, but I am in an uncomfortable position at the moment, but I'll work through it. But I did break my leg last week. And you know what? Here's how I'll tie this into Jeff, because it's true. I had to call on my elders and deacons and people like that to fill in for worship, because I just did not find myself in a space in which I could write a sermon and fulfill my tasks as, in worship that I normally do. And they showed up and they wore their stoles, and they were just, it was really lovely that I could call, like, it's why I became a member of our tradition, because I wanted something that was congregationally based, that I could say that it everything doesn't just fall on one person, that it is communally shared and communally celebrated, and God was still present, and so was Jeff One-Row.
And when you tell the story, when you have the symbols, when you point to a truth that is greater than what is happening, but that truth that happens in that space, do it with style, do it with aplomb, do it with grace, do it with Jeff One-Row Designs. You can celebrate the 17 years of making ordinary time extraordinary by going to Jeff One-Row, JEFFWUNROW.com, preferably after the show. But if you're like listening to this and not doing your job at work, go to it now. What do we care? You can use our special promo code, which is right down here if you are watching, and if you are listening, it is 2 on 1. Those are letters. 15. Those are numbers. Do it at checkout for 15% off your entire stole order. Spiff, does that mean one stole?
No.
Well, it does if you're ordering one, but does it mean 6 stoles?
Yes.
Yes. Any stoles. You could get 60 stoles.
All the stoles. You could buy his entire catalog.
You should, and make
Buy him
sure,
out.
make sure you use the 2-on-1 code so he knows that we sent you his way. We do thank Jeff Monroe Designs for being our top sponsor today. And now, Lady Wolfleton, it's time to continue our foray into the discussion of popular culture by discussing Bridgerton with our repeated guest, who I'm going to check to see if she is in the Five Timers Club as of today.
I think she is.
Is this number 5 for her? Let's find out together. Let's welcome in Whitney Waller. Hello, Whitney. It's good to see you today. Hey, is this your 5th time on 2-on-1?
What?
Is this your 5th time, Whitney?
It might be. I'm assuming that my
So-
robe is in the mail.
Exactly. That's exactly where it is.
Club.
Sarah Nave Fisher just joined our Five Timers Club. So I'm going to look while you introduce yourself and tell us who you are, what you're doing, and why Bridgerton.
Sure. I'm Whitney Waller. I'm the senior minister at Creekwood Christian Church. And I'm currently talking to 2 of my favorite people in the whole wide world about a show that I'm not saying is my favorite show in the whole wide world, but it does feel like the love child of 3 of my favorite shows. Those being Gossip Girl, Scandal, and Pride and Prejudice. Not a show, but like, you know, a vibe, a sense of being. And were all those things to come together, it's basically Bridgerton. So here we are. Here
With
we are.
the like vague kind of comedy, like kind of obtuseness of your Wet Hot American Summer Days. There are some only because you said that was your favorite. Like the first time you came on, I was like, this is in my top, and you're like, this is my favorite, and I was like, all right.
Wet Hot American Summer is my actual favorite movie. That is true. That is true.
By the way, we haven't done First Day of Camp yet, or 10 years later, whichever the one it is. So
scrap Bridgerton. Let's go.
It's true. It's something I could talk off the top of my head about. Whitney and I sometimes go on vacation together, and sometimes I give her t-shirts that have Wet Hot people on them.
They do, and I wear them and fondly remember my time on vacation with Smith.
well, now I'm just jealous, but good.
When I drug her to a cemetery. This got off the rail from Bridgerton.
I don't know. I feel like a lot of that vacation had like some courtly vibes. So
Yeah, I mean, we were in Connecticut. It was
we were in Connecticut. We were in period dress the whole time, which no one asked us to do, but
Corsets, whalebone corsets.
yeah, but just like the little top ones, because it's Regency style, which I have had a lot of TikToks hand delivered to me by my For You page to help me understand the dress of the time a little bit better.
Which was that jean jackets, really.
Yeah,
So-
jean jackets, plaid, and tiaras. So we've covered it.
So for those of you unaware of what or how or where the hell we are right now, Bridgerton is a period soap opera. Like, is that a fair way to put it? It's kind of a
Oh,
drama.
100%.
Oh yeah.
It's kind of a hot mess, and it follows the sex ploits of the 6 Bridgerton children who are named alphabetically, and they're all looking for love. Apparently, the format is that over the 6 seasons, which that actually is my first question, but over the 6 seasons, it's going to focus on one of the Bridgerton children each time, but there's intrigue and there's drama, and it is like Gossip Girl and Scandal, and it's kind of a hot mess, and I'm not sure if I like it.
It's based on books, so like that's why every season is different, because it follows the single book of that family. So for those of you that are on spicy TikTok, you'll see that those TikToks come through as well.
They do. Also, just a quick correction: there are 8 Bridgerton children.
I apologize.
But
right.
2 of them are pretty little.
They're
So
named alphabetically A through.
It'll be the last 2 books or last 2 seasons.
those are like George R.R. Martin, like last 2 seasons, like 20 years later.
Well, so actually, I want to talk about that first and foremost, right? Because here's the deal. So Bridgerton it seems to be guaranteed 6 seasons, no matter how much of like a crazy ass mess it's going to be.
Sure.
And My husband likes this show, so I do not watch it with him because when I say things like, this is a crazy ass hot mess, it's almost like he takes it personally. And I understand why he would, because it seems like I'm mocking him, which I'm not. I love hot messes. Look at my life and my vocation. But so with 6 seasons guaranteed, it's kind of like Game of Thrones, right? They thought we literally cannot mess up Game of Thrones. We have this final season, and God, they did it so bad it disappeared from the zeitgeist. Like, do you remember how everybody talked about Game of Thrones until like the end, and then we just
and then that last season was pretty bummer.
Oh, I see a connection between Game of Thrones season 8 and the possibility of what can happen with Bridgerton as it goes on, because we don't know the ending at this point. There's 2 more books, right? Or would there be? Anyways,
I don't know.
The church as a institution, and perhaps I'm only talking about the white Protestant mainline American church. I realize we're not monolithic. Do we act like we're guaranteed a final season? That is, if we have 6 years to do this, can we fool around and find out?
That's interesting, because I think that the church probably functions more like The Simpsons, where we just assume we will never be canceled.
Ooh.
Right? Like, there's no need to actually indulge in the idea of a final season and what the buildup is to it, unless the final season is like a new way that we're referring to like eschatological happenings, which I don't know, perhaps for the 2-on-1's next book. But I think that the church really much more thinks of itself as a place where, in the culture of like ratings driven culture and consumerism, the church thinks that we're sort of immune to that.
So I just looked it up. I'm not going to act like I knew this. So there are 9 Bridgerton books, but that's because the 9th book is called Happily Ever After. It is a wrap up of all of them. So I'm going to say, yes, we do think that season 8, we are guaranteed that happily ever after if we lean into the theologies that, that we proclaim, that there's this kind of like, we get the heaven, we get the salvation, we get the all of that, because look at the work that we've been putting in through these seasons after seasons. And so there's this kind of bow at the end, this like happily ever after that we are definitely leaning into. And why I don't think that, we can get tired of these same old stories. I think that there's the difference in Game of Thrones and Bridgerton, which is a weird statement in and of itself, because there are many.
Go on. The only difference.
The only difference is that these are kind of singular story. Like, yes, they weave in and out of each other, but they're definitely like there's a focus. It's kind of like the biblical canon, right? You get these stories that tie into each other, but they're very distinct. They're very like, here are the actors and players in this part of the story. And so I in hopes it feels more like a mini series each season rather than how much continued story are we going on. And I think the church runs into that roteness when we think of ourselves as kind of having to go back into the story and in and out, rather than thinking ourselves in these episodic or in these kind of mini-series ways, taking in context and culture for our time and like where we've been written.
Yeah, I think that's like a reasonable observation. And I also, something that ties in a little bit to thinking about the story and what's being told, Bridgerton, clearly a work of fiction, but one of the things that I do think is really, it's true. This
is a documentary. This is a docuseries.
Yeah, this is a docuseries. Real human stories. No, but in
like Real Housewives of Bridgerton.
Yes, but so no, like here's like a genuinely compelling point about this show that does make it really interesting to me, that when I was researching for our episode today, because that's how much I care about you guys, I did some reading. So the story itself is imagined as an alternative history of England based upon a 1940s theory that Queen Charlotte was biracial. And that this was something that was like brushed under the rug, that people tried to like stamp out. And so Queen Charlotte is the queen in the show. And they took that idea of Queen Charlotte being biracial and that actually opening up race relations and allowing society to be a multiracial society in early 19th century London. And that's like the idea that they run with in this show, which is really interesting because they do some things well and some things poorly, with how race is a part of Bridgerton. But just a really interesting thing, and thinking about a show that is incredibly diverse in its casting. And I think doing some interesting things with alternative history and drawing us in as viewers that way. And I just thought that was an interesting fact to reflect upon in thinking about, you know, when we come back to revisit stories and to hear those stories told in different ways, of seeing who's a part of the story as we're reimagining it. Because I do think there's value to that. And that's part of what we do when we look at scripture too, right? Is bringing different people into the story at different parts.
Totally. I love, well, what I think one of the things that drew me in initially was how diverse it was, right? That it's like, you don't necessarily often see this portrayed, but it's also what happens when we allow Black women to lead, right? This is a Shonda Land production. And like Shonda has like, I think Netflix just gave her like a bunch of like, they like greenlight everything. They're like, here you go, like get to put in these things. And she was like, cool, like, let's make sure that like, you know, diversity is front and center, that Black narratives are front and center in this. And you know, our Bible, everyone knows I broke my leg. There's not a
I was gonna say, how's that pain medication?
The problem is that I have not taken any this morning. So you're getting, we'll send something they did not mean to say. You're getting just what?
You're doing great.
Just really crushing it out here. But our Bible is written by and for Black and brown people. And so it's like, how do we make sure that, you know, the narratives of the people that wrote it and are right there, that are within it, are centered and not just kind of white we have done. So
yeah.
Arthur. No, I don't have anything necessarily right now. I'm just digesting the point. I do find it kind of fascinating on this alternative history in Queen Charlotte, and of course this is during the Georges in British history. There's at least one more George, and then they move into Victoria. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking. I usually have a question and I could try to make one up as I babble for 3 minutes, but I don't feel like that's respectful to our time together. Can we talk about Penelope Featherington?
Yes.
Okay, so she's my favorite.
She's great.
She's the worst. I mean that in a good way, but she's
XOXO Bridgerton.
That's what I'm saying.
I know.
Okay, so she's 100% Lady Whistledown, right?
Yes,
Like
she is. That is unequivocal. That is correct. Yeah, and I do think that it's funny because initially that was the element of the show that is supposed to be the most intrigue. And I think in the first season they do a good job with that. But honestly, the reveal of knowing that Penelope is Lady Whistledown kind of takes down a notch how fascinating that part of the story is for me. Not because I don't think that the actress who plays Penelope does a great job, Nicola Coughlan, I think is her name, but not that I don't think she does a great job, not that I don't find the character fun. It's more that it like treads upon the things that I really liked about Penelope as a round character and makes her a lot more static. Like now she's a gossip queen who in the second season, spoiler alert, we find that like this is going to really destroy like her most meaningful friendship. We get like, I don't know, she just kind of ends up falling into this very much like gossip girl, catty, mean girl category where they haven't quite yet done a very good job of situating why Penelope feels the need to be about this gossip. Like there are bits and pieces of that connected to her family who are like pretty much on the outs with upper society thanks to some really poor decisions that her dad made. But Penelope didn't really seem like she was invested in the social culture writ large anyway. And so in the second season, it's really kind of playing like she's just sad that a boy doesn't like her. And so she's like reading everyone to filth publicly, which maybe that's just how 15, 16-year-old girls have acted since the beginning of time. But I'm here to give 15 and 16-year-old girls a lot more credit.
Yes.
It's kind of fascinating to me. So like I'm at the point, my daughter's 11 and we talk a lot about what gossip is and what gossip isn't, right? And we've landed on the definition that gossip is, it can be true or it can be untrue, but it is information that is conveyed about a person that would not be conveyed to the person, or in a manner in which it would not be conveyed. One of the rules that we have with congregational work here at Riverside is that we talk to people, we don't talk about people. And it's really hard to do, because if you name it at the beginning of the meeting, what happens all the time is that we will talk about people, even in the best possible circumstance, but it's not representative. It's representative of us being conveyed onto them rather than being in dialogue with or dialogue to. I always love period dramas because of the, like the Gilded Age. At some point we should talk about that anticlimactic mess as well. Much prefer Bridgerton. But there's always this, well, one, why are we drawn to stories of high society, of people acting poorly in high society? Two, and this is where the question comes back to the church. Do we have a special society and like dance in which we do congregationally or ecclesially that we have to, do we have to code switch to be a church, much like we have to code switch to watch Bridgerton?
I think that's a good question. And I think the answer to that is yes, in a pretty striking sense. In thinking about the show as it pertains to the life of church, I'm really drawn into sort of a metaphorical space between, so a big premise of it is that at the beginning of the season, when the debutantes are being debuted, they're presented before the queen for the queen to sign off on. And I do think that there's really an element of that in our church culture of thinking about, those matriarchs and patriarchs within the church, who so often it feels like, well, those are the folks who have to give their buy-in. Those are the folks that have to give their blessing. And if they don't do those things, then your idea, your plan, what it is you want to do, like that will not be the diamond of the season. Like that will be a thing that fails. And I think that that's interesting because a lot of the friction that we see in the show and a lot of the friction that we see in our churches is that that's not really a model that is sustainable or serving anybody ultimately, right? Like the queen hates having to have these overtures of, having to sign a seal of approval on every single one of these people. It's a model that's deeply steeped in patriarchy, and that's not really serving the young women or the young men who are a part of the paradigm either. And I say young women and young men because we haven't really had a presentation of non-binary characters in the show yet. But I imagine that they are also feeling pretty unserved by this model. So
I'm sorry, Spiff, if I'm talking too much. I'm fascinated by so Alexander Dumas is a contemporary in this time and space, and Alexander Dumas was a Black man. And if I'm positive it was the Count of Monte Cristo, I think, where there's very much a lesbian character. There's two. They're very much in love with each other. They run off together. One of them is dressed like a man so that they can convey through towns more. And at one point, like they're in an inn, but they've left the story and like somebody bursts into the room and they're sleeping in the same bed. And he did everything but say like, these are two people of the same gender expression who are romantically coupled with each other. I suppose it's this. I like Bridgerton because it's acknowledging that, hey, race existed. And what if we said we were going to actually address race, for better or for worse, in how this happens? I always love the queer period dramas. Sorry to jump back on the Gilded Age for a moment, but the gays are always evil in the world of Downton Abbey and the Gilded Age, right? There's always a gay character who's duplicitous in the first episode. how do we tell new stories, and how do we tell stories that are just and equitable without stereotyping? How do we build the Bible is written for and by brown and black people. How do we tell these stories without disenfranchising any voices, or by re-enfranchising the right ones? I don't know. I think the question is probably too big. But Whitney, you speak fluent Arthur. Spiff, you do too. Figure something out of that.
There's
Please.
I think in both of the kind of questions that were kind of posed, like it, for me, I think we have to allow those that are coming in, like the new stories, to actually be told, right? Like how often, one of the things that I don't mean to trivialize this part in our church, because I've never not cried while watching a baptism, but there is something about the way in which it's kind of like churches that I've been in and seen, like we do the same thing every single time, and not like the actual baptism, but like how you prepare for it, what is expected of you, how you're supposed to react, all of that. And I don't know that we as a church at large allow for the new stories to come forth from these kids, these younger people, and at least in our tradition, are the ones that, 6th grade-ish is when you get baptized and you get to make that declaration. But you're still looked at as young, you're still a kid. Like, what does it look like when we're saying, no, we've covenanted with you, you're here, you get to, like, it's not just Youth Sunday, you get to do all the things, tell your story with God anew, because there is something about these kind of deb balls and things like that that feels a little like, the dance, what you're expect, where your feet are supposed to go. You're given the anointing to say, yes, you can enter society, you're baptized, you're in, here you go. But nothing necessarily, we expect the change to happen within you, but we don't necessarily expect the change to happen within the entire community always, or maybe we do in that moment, but there's never an accountability to that. And I think that there's something there in that, in the way in the Queen is like her own anxiety and feeling around that. And like, she doesn't want to have to do this. She, like, it's just live your life, come in, change the world, do the thing. And there's something that Lady Whistledown, like, or Penelope is actually doing that shakes things up just a hair. Is she doing it in the right way? No. If, like, would she be able to be more faithfully assertive in all of these, like, her own, stories that she wants to tell if she were in better relationship with everyone, including herself? Probably. But there's something to the, this is how it's always done and we have to continue to do it, that happens every year, sort of a thing that the church would do best to say, what if we start anew?
Yeah. Well, I think too, like, kind of wrapped up in that, in your question, Arthur, about just the stories that we allow to be told, in thinking about how, if Bridgerton is supposed to be serving as like an alternative or a counter history, right? Like a reimagining, and the church is a space that's supposed to exist counterculturally, right? Like we're supposed to be living into what the kingdom of God looks like and how we build that up and how we make that an experience that people have. I think that in a sense, we, in the best spaces of church and serving wonderful congregations, we have those experiences of like, oh my gosh, look at how we have opened ourselves up. Look at how we have reimagined this. Look at how we are paving a way for new stories to be told and new things to be considered and to be amplified and given like the platform, the podium, the pulpit, and all of that. And still, we come up against the thing where we're like, oh, but that's maybe a step too far for right now. And I think that's a little bit of what happens, in your point, Arthur, of thinking about like the queer experience and how absent it is from this show, where there was an invested effort to say like, well, we're reimagining history. We're not going just from like historically what would have happened, which is one, a cop out, because the historical things that did happen would involve the lives of queer people. Mm-hmm. Like queer people existed and were there. Their stories weren't the dominant ones being told or the safe ones for them to tell, but they were absolutely there. And so why wouldn't we lean into the opportunity presented by saying we're trying to refocus the lens to a new experience. But I do think that happens in church a lot. I think that we love when our youth are presenting in worship and they're the ones leading us until they do the thing that we're like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, that's maybe a little bit too much. I can't believe that you just wanted me to take cookies and milk as communion.
You can't rap about the nativity.
Right. But I think, I do think that there's something to be said for what are the places where it rubs up against our own discomfort, and realizing that that should be our invitation to lean into that and to see what that's about, because there might actually be some real countercultural new world building things that come out of that.
I like that. It's something I've always appreciated. Like King James the First of England was like super bisexual, probably just very gay and predatory, so not always the best thing. But it was just talked around. It was just worked around. People were just like, yep, it's something that happens. James Buchanan, I forget the name of his boyfriend, but they used to refer to James Buchanan as like Mrs. Smith, and they'd get invitations to Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Miss, and Smith is not the right last name, but Mrs. Smith was James Buchanan. It's the story can never be unitary, and from any perspective, ultimately. But I think decentering has to allow decentering. I don't know. It's if it's moved over here, this part is still, the story is just off center. I'm not thinking well today. I've been taking Spiff's painkillers. Ha 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 ha. I'm just kidding.
A twist.
Hey,
Yeah,
that's right. Unfortunately, I'm sorry, I was trying to do this.
I do think though, like with that decentering piece and thinking about the stories that are told, I do also want to say a piece of, I don't think that it's every storyteller's responsibility to make sure they are telling every story. I do think it's every storyteller's responsibility to make sure that the stories they're telling with integrity and a recognition that there are other stories to be told. And so I do think there's room in Bridgerton for it to be a little bit more expansive in the voices that it's highlighting, the one that it's emphasizing. But I do kind of side with my pal Glenn Weldon, who's a culture critic for NPR, and his initial take on Bridgerton, which was, I felt like I was promised that this show was going to be much gayer. And that is also how I feel about it.
Yes.
So
that makes my heart very happy.
1,000. Well, and I mean, even talking about this Bridgerton as a whole, so we're in a conversation right now with my community around like expansive fertility conversations and things like that, and family planning, and what does that mean for everyone in the church, and how do you support and know or ask the right questions and things like that. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that we don't think of, like Bridgerton's like first season appeal was like, it was sexy. It was some, it was like there was this kind of drive, and like pastors aren't really necessarily allowed to be not like sex symbols, but you don't think of us as sexual people outside of, the church. I mean, not in the church, you know what I mean? Like, that's not what I meant, but like you really, it's like seeing your teacher outside of the classroom, like in the wild. You're like, you don't see your pastor in the wild as a full human. You see us in, preaching on Sunday, and here's our job, and here's what we're called to, and it's a very specific job that we have, because there is a calling and something a lot, kind of often deeper than things, other jobs in which you may just kind of apply for, right? But we lose some of that humanity. And so like even talking in these spaces about like shows that are meant to revolve around like relationships and sex and high class society, and should pastors be fancy, and all of the like runs the risk of are we showing our hands too soon that we are whole people? Are we showing
Yes, great question, and the perfect time for me to share with you an anecdote about watching Bridgerton and being a pastor. So when the first season came out, I had a congregant who was having surgery like a couple of days after this season came out, and was talking with them, just, how are you feeling, blah, blah, blah. They're like, oh, I'm good. I'm really just wondering what I'm going to binge. I had watched like the first 4 or 5 episodes of Bridgerton, and I was like, well, I'm watching Bridgerton. Very enjoyable. Like, just like, just like very like casual. Like if you're into like Pride and Prejudice and like soapy stuff, it's fun. That night I sat down and watched the episode from that first season. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, it's a sexy stairwell scene that the second it started happening, I was like, I have to text this person right now and tell them that like I did not see this episode when I recommended this show to them. I am mortified. How am I going to look this person in the face? Oh my gosh. And so I send this text to my congregant and I'm like, I just need you to know that when I recommended this show to you, I was only 5 episodes in. So in the event that you are watching it and you get to episode 6, please know that I had not seen that episode before I told you this. And their immediate text back was, haha, I have already finished the entire season. I loved it.
But also, like, why would that be a problem, right? It's like,
right.
Exactly.
And like their response was perfect, but that I was paralyzed in this place of like, oh my gosh, like this isn't a show for it to be okay that I recommended as a human being, versus some other things that it's really interesting that like Game of Thrones isn't a show that necessarily popped up on my radar in that way. And I mean, in those first several seasons, it's ridiculously sexual and ridiculously violent.
But we're fine with violence as a culture. We'll laugh at heads exploding in the King's.
Oh, for sure.
And it's, we're gonna do butt stuff, like people freak out about it. A friend of mine tells a story about when she was pregnant and how much it threw off people, like when she would preside at the table or when she would preach. And it finally, like, because it's this idea of like, oh, my minister has very clearly had sex before. Look what has happened. And it wasn't until she named it and I guess almost challenged people to like accept that idea of it. I can say as a gay man in ministry, it's amazing to me that like it freaks some people out. Like I really do think there are some members of my church who have looked at me and been like, I need to try to figure out his sex life. Like any details about it besides he's a married gay man.
Yeah, I think that it is an interesting is the euphemistic word I am choosing to code with for lots of other words.
Demanding, obnoxious, intense,
frustrating, inappropriate, disrespectful. The list goes on.
Interesting.
I do think that it is interesting that when we think about anybody that we put up on a pedestal, our immediate need is to tidy and reconcile every single aspect of their life into what makes it permissible for them to be on that pedestal, and the values that we feel like we're having to negotiate around for them to exist there. And I don't think that happens just in the church. I think that happens lots of places, but I do think church is a particularly tricky place for it to happen, because I think that we're just kind of behind the curve on allowing people the fullness of their humanity. And I would say not even pastors, but I think members too. I think that, and that goes back to that initial conversation we were having about, what is gossip and what is something that we share about our lives or about the lives of others that's in a spirit of uplifting them and walking alongside them, versus what's something that we share about our lives from a place of shame or guilt or worry that will be seen differently. And what are things people share about us that are because they feel like we should feel shame or guilt or be seen differently. I think that's a complicated piece of doing church, and it's not something we always do well.
Amen. No, I mean, I've thought about this often. Like if I, for whatever reason, like if I got pregnant, right? Like as a single woman right now, like there would be so many questions of like, how? Because we don't dissect, kind of understand or nuance the virgin birth. Like we're sitting here like our entire faith is built on, especially around in Arthur's favorite season of Advent, which is just around the corner.
Right.
It's always almost Advent somewhere.
It's always almost Advent, but right. So it's a little bit of that, right? Where there's so much, there has been historically and traditionally in the church, so much emphasis put on the virginity of Mary and why this is such a big thing, and rather than just like,
It's a bad translation of the Greek word young woman.
Right. And so, there's that portion of single women that is overlooked as part of members of larger society. And like, would that, if I showed up pregnant, would it be a blessing? Like we would say, oh my gosh, like everyone else, it's like, I'm pregnant here, here are the things, and the church wants to celebrate a new life and a new baby. But then it would be like, oh, but like unmarried, and like the side gossips that would happen, even if it were planned, even if I went and decided like that I'm doing it in an IVF track or something, what I mean, whatever, or if it were, some sort of unfortunate way in which I got pregnant, like it's the both and that we don't allow to hold tenderly together so often, because we have one singular narrative of how you're supposed to enter society, how you're supposed to lead, how you're supposed to be a part of this community.
It's fascinating to me. I think it was Ann Tyler in like the most crazy ass interview ever. It's also the one where she said it would be foolish, but I should be allowed to write from the viewpoint of a Black man, which I'm still struggling with. But Ann Tyler, the novelist, the Armchair Tour, and forgive me, this will all come back around, I promise.
I trust you implicitly.
I think it was Ann Tyler who said, we can have authors historically who have done terrible things and who have lived awful lives who still contribute to the conversation. And I think she was specifically talking about like, what do we do with the fact that every early novelist in American history and in American literature was pretty much on the side of or the owner of other people and a participant in slavery? Like, what does that mean? How do we deal with that? And I may be incorrect, and please let me know if I am within it. And I'm not suggesting that having a child as a single woman is the same as participating in the system of slavery, but we create a social norm, and those social norms have to change because we're adaptive, transformative human beings. But what I think the church does really well is hold on to the old norms, because if they worked once, they have to work forever. And therefore, we can't decenter whiteness from the white American mainline Protestant church because we've never done it before. And what would it mean to have to deal with it? We want to see women solely in leadership, or we want to see youth reinventing and reimagining and doing it. But there's the momentum of tradition, which is just the calcified rock of our own bullshit. I'm sorry, that was all over the place, and I beg your pardon. I think we have to have the space to say, what is my perspective, and can I, what does it mean to say that we do representative ministry? Mm-hmm. A friend of mine is launching an open and affirming church, and I wish him the best. And he's also a straight guy, so he's talking to me about like the LGBTQ perspective, and I'm like, dude, you need like 10 of us. You need to have a queer council. Because I'm not.
It's not monolithic. You're not the only one.
Monolithic, but none of it is monolithic. But does that mean we can write nothing? No, of course not. But do we have to practice grace? Yes. But should we practice grace to the point of being oppressed by someone else's interpretation? No, it's a sticky wicket. Oh, I'll say that Britishly so it ties into Bridgerton. It's a sticky wicket. See, I'm allowed to do that because you can make fun of British people stuff. That was irony.
It was. I appreciated it. I think that I'm about to sneeze. Sorry.
That's not allowed here on 2-on-1.
Okay, well, it went away the second I said it, so it's fine. That would have been very untoward. So I'm glad that I did not. It would have been the talk of the ton. But I do think so. I think that thinking about that Ann Tyler quote, Arthur, and sort of the ideas shared there, I mean, that's the issue with the Bible, right? Like, we go and we read these stories and they still have to have meaning within the structure of our faith lives, but it is that piece of we have to reevaluate what that meaning is. In my congregation, we've been going through the Bible beginning at Genesis, and we're going all the way through Revelation.
Yeah, you're doing a podcast about that, aren't you?
We are the scripture soundtrack, but so thank you for that plug. In doing that, it's been this really interesting journey of, we've got folks who have read through the whole Bible before, people who have never done that, and going back and looking at some of these stories. And when you're doing it all so close together, realizing like, the way that like we told that story is really problematic. And the parts of the story that we choose to lift up, like, we spent a lot of time with King David, and in thinking about him as a character who is lauded after this man after God's own heart. And it's like, oh, wow, I would hope that there are literally thousands of other men that would do a better job of being after God's own heart. And I guarantee you there were thousands of women who were. So I think that it's that piece of the relationship that we have to have with literature, with scripture, with any of these things that belong to a historical framework, to bring them into our contemporary framework, the relationship that we have with them. It can be a relationship of love. It can be a relationship of appreciation, of inspiration. It also has to be one where we are very thoroughly committed to learning lessons from what has come before. Those are not supposed to be places that we look to feel justification for our own bad behavior, right? It's the difference in the person who says, oh, well, it's okay, like for us to elect someone to office who's done horrible things and, committed adultery and is awful to women and brutalizes people emotionally and psychologically, because like that's what King David did, but he was a man after God's own heart, that's far different than being able to say that like leaders can have falls from grace, and when they're truly penitent about that, when they really do change who they are as a result of that experience, like that's a very different lesson that we're perpetuating forward.
Well, and I would, to tie into that, sorry if I might, like, so season 1 is with Daphne and Simon, right? And so, and like, you're wanting to root for them. Like the whole premise is like, you want these like characters to fall in love and all of them, but like they're also terrible to each other. Like at one point she tries to like, essentially she sexually assault him, like, but yeah, I was like, sorry, but trigger warning. We'll do a trigger warning at the top of, I guess, the show as well, because like she tries to have his baby without his consent, and all of that, and he withholds lots of, like, there's this emotional and physicalness that like they both withhold from each other in really toxic ways, and yet like we're supposed to sit here and be like, yes, it's sexy, it's cool, like we want them to to last through it and come back together. And it's like, if these were people in your church, really, I would hope that as pastors we would all be like, oh no, like two of you need a time out, like, like you need therapy, you need help. This is not the great love story you think you are telling. And that is fiction. So let us learn from that, right? Like, as you're saying, like you've got to be able to and willing to learn from these stories and hold them in tension with what's actually being said, with what actually may have happened, and what is being cast as the like kind of vision forward. Like, we don't want a bunch of young girls looking at this being like, I need to, trap these men with babies and, and like, and that's how I'm going to get people to love me and blah, blah. And it's like, no, like you are worthy and good enough. And yet, everyone's binging season 2.
Right. And I think related to that too, Spiff, is thinking about for us as church, what really taking stock of what environment are we creating that allows at minimum and at like maximum encourages some social norms and practices and ways of being and behavior that are damaging to people's lives. Like, what are the narratives that we're telling around marriage that, maybe lead people to thinking that there are parts of their marriage that, are bad, are negative, are not okay, and are not healthy, but because of the ways that we talk about marriage as, divorce is awful, it's your last option, like all of these things. And everyone has disagreements. And oh yeah, everybody has things that they'll put on the list about what makes their spouse awful. But then it's like, you're looking at, okay, but here's my list. Like, is this awful enough yet? And like what that looks like. And I think that's part of the show, is that like they are trapped in the culture around them that has led both of them to think that like these are the only ways that they can live and be. And I will say that like that arc for those several episodes is so uncomfortable. And I do actually think that there's nuance to the way that they come around on that. Like, there's not a lot of conversation, but that's because this is not a show that is really concerned with conversation. But they do both have like some pivotal like epiphany moments that I do think lead them to a new understanding of self that allows them to be in that relationship differently. But I don't think that that's how we do things a lot of the time in church around relationships and ideals that we're lifting up in romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Well, and conversation takes at least two people. I always think about, was it Erastus who translated John 1 as in the beginning was a conversation, and the conversation was God, and the conversation was with God. So it's funny to me that the show is about relationship, but it's not about good relationship. It's about relationship without conversation. Perhaps it's more of a statement piece than how it goes. Whitney, we are so glad that you are joining us for your 5th time on 2-on-1. We will send you a robe in the mail.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
We do, as you know, because we've done it 4 times before with you, end our conversations with a final question.
Yes, thanks for coming on and for talking Bridgerton, and through my brain this week, which is not fully functioning, but has watched Bridgerton. So there we are. There we go.
That's the best way for your brain to be while watching Bridgerton.
Probably very true. But again, thank you for coming on. What biblical theme, character, narrative, verse, or person are you most reminded of in the Bible through Bridgerton?
So I'm going to go ahead and say that in thinking about reimagined histories, I am actually, it's not a reimagined one at all, taking a very, I'm going to say like 19th century and prior read of Esther. And that is what Bridgerton reminds me of. Esther, some courtly intrigue and drama. That's exactly right. Definitely some Bachelor-esque components here, and certainly competing for royal favor as a means of survival. Are those my roses?
Mm-hmm. Will you accept this rose?
I will accept that rose. Thank you very much. But it does remind me a lot of the story of Esther, and finding space where it's not just those things that have been assigned cultural significance for women that make them successful, because I do think that's something interesting that Bridgerton holds some of the tension around, especially with characters like Eloise and Penelope, who are not interested in being the diamond of the season, but are actually interested in discovering who they are and having full actualized selves, but figuring out how to do that inside the confines of this structure really does remind me of Esther. So that's mine.
I like it. I'm gonna go with, I forget which telling of the rich young man or the rich ruler or whatever, but at one point it says in the text, Jesus looked on them and loved them, or looked on him and loved him. And I think that's always the challenge we have with this kind of stuff. Like, it's a compelling narrative. It's full of disciples and rich young men and fools and failures, and yet here we are. And it's a work in progress, as am I. So that's my short answer.
Nice.
Love it. I'm gonna go, okay, that's what I was writing down earlier. I was like, this is my final answer. I'm gonna go with Lady Whistledown is David, because I think that there is something to that. The church loves David, like as a character, as we talked about earlier. I was trying not to do my last question. I was trying not to give away my last answer, my final answer in that conversation. But we love David, and he's so problematic. Lady Whistledown is voiced by Julie Andrews, who is just a global treasure, and everyone loves her. And we wouldn't want to say, hey, the things that you are saying are really toxic and are hurting society, and like you're just gossiping, and it's not necessarily your best self or portraying best self in culture or community. And so for me, it's like there's this both and for that character and who portrays her, and David and how he is portrayed, and like kind of on that flip side, one is loved and one is they're both problematic, they're both loved, they're both kind of, they hold that nuance. Yeah, that's where I'm going.
I love it. Whitney, thank you for joining us today for Bridgerton.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, y'all.
I did hear there was a secret chord that Lady Featherington played, and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for gossip, do you? This has been 2-on-1, talking Bridgerton with Whitney Waller. On behalf of everybody here, please go to jeffwanro.com and check out the wide catalog. Stoles, liturgical textiles, everything happening. Not just you, Whitney, our deuces as well. Use the code 2on115.
You specifically too.
Yes.
I will. I'm doing it right now. Bye.
Get more 2-on-1 at twoononeproject.com.